Doc, so I'm someone that actually has experience in genetic engineering, and by that I'll give my qualifications. I'm not going to share my name because I don't want to dox myself, but I worked in genetically engineering fruit flies, and I also worked in genetically engineering the brain so that in Parkinson's disease we can regrow the basal ganglia substantia nigra, the dopaminergic cells. So this is kind of like CRISPR, if you've heard of it. It's more common, but I was using viruses, harmless viruses to do this. And in my previous research, I was using optogenetics and thermogenetics, which is creating genetic models where we can alter and mediate the genes and change the species over time. So it's kind of like artificially doing the work of genetics and gene flow that would happen in nature through natural selection, but we're just focusing on certain specific traits. And so I want to talk about this Sydney Sweeney ad as an expert in this, and in the spirit of it, I'm going to be putting this. So let's talk about it. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there about genes and how genes work. And the first thing I want to start off is that I will set a paper later today. I'll try to cite a paper in this. I will cite a paper for this, but and I can go into this in more detail later today. But the blue eye allele isn't necessarily useful in any way. There's a lot of questions as to why this allele even exists, but one thing to keep in mind is that the way that genes work is not necessarily the same as the advertisements kind of make out. So in the advertisements, they try to make it seem like genetics, sorry, these genes are kind of big. They try to make it seem like genetics is just determined by one gene, and that's it. Oh, your parent had blue eyes, now you have blue eyes. Both your parents have blue eyes, now you have blue eyes. That's not how it works at all. Anyone who knows anything about genetics knows that there's a lot of variation. And that's because the field of genetics is extremely outdated. We now have a new field, which is called epigenetics. And I would say epigenetics are a way better representation of how genes actually work. So in epigenetics, you can see that different genes are expressed through both the parents and the combination, but the combination doesn't necessarily indicate that the person will turn out that way. Depending on the combination and the environmental factors, which is what epigenetics considers. So we'll talk about it first. Later I can show a diagram if people are interested. But the way that genes are passed on is there's recessive genes, and blue eyes is a recessive gene. So even if you have two parents that have blue eyes, you might not necessarily get that. Or if you don't have a parent with blue eyes, you might get it. So it's not something that you can tell that someone has a gene by the expression. Another thing is that the blue eye gene does come, and the blue eye trait, the indicated trait, does come with a lot of problems. So that's why scientists are kind of always wondering why it even exists, is because it comes with like ocular degeneration, a series of other health problems. I'll cite the paper, but so scientists, they kind of just think that this might not be a passed down trait. It might be more like a defect. I'm not saying defects are bad, it's just abnormal, like like alopecia, hyperpigmentation, albinism, all genetic disorders like cerebral palsy. All these are genetic conditions that come from a mutation, and the mutation of blue eyes isn't necessarily correlated with it being at all correlated with anything that can help people. It's just random, okay? So like any race can have this gene. It's not necessarily correlated with just being white. Anyone can have a blue eye gene, and anyone can get it at any time, because as long as someone in your family somewhere down the line has the allele, you can get it, and it can also be generally mutated by the environment. So she really is these ads are really lacking a lot of understanding on how complex that different traits are. It's not that simple, okay? It's really not that simple. And another thing to keep in mind is that there is a history of correlating people who have blue eyes and blonde hair with incest. And something that is proven genetically is that the more different your genes are from someone else, the more likely that there won't be traits passed on, is because traits cluster together in the allele. They're not just passed, it's not like a single gene will determine a specific trait. There will be a cluster of genes that work together in an allele that make a trait come true. And then they also cluster together with genes for other traits. So it's not, you don't just get one trait passed down, you get a bunch of things with it. And so the more similar you are genetically to someone else, the more likelihood that you will have similar alleles for problematic traits, because most genetic conditions don't necessarily cause us to have good things happen to us. Like humans, every single gene means something. Even the junk genes, they're now finding out that it's actually very important. So we've been able to finally figure out that all of our genes are very important, but they do cluster together. So if you have say for example, you have a woman who's very similar to a man, and they're closely related, they're more likely to have genes that cause birth defects, spinal bifida, a lot of birth defects that can be passed down will be common if the person has similar genes to the other person. So the actual best strategy for preventing health conditions, genetically determined health conditions, is definitely to merge very different genomes with each other, because you have less likely a chance that your ancestors will both have the recessive genes for very difficult conditions like Huntington's disease. And we can see that in communities where they're very small community and they're not exposed to real world, that they often have some very severe health conditions and some very severe genetic conditions, like a high rate of Huntington's disease or even blue skin or something weird. We see the Habsburg chin in the Habsburg dynasty. In King Tut, we see that he had a club foot and a lot of genetic issues, and this comes from being too closely genetically related to someone else that is similar genetically to you, and we'll call this incest. But even if it's like second cousin, third cousin, century back, the more times that there has been similar people with similar genetics in breeding, the more that these genetic traits can pile up and then lead to very, very problem conditions. And that's why when we see like these isolated communities, they always, in the South, there's something where this is common, they always have a ton of very bad traits, but this could even be similar. Like if blue genes are blue-eyed genes are very rare. So if people are genetically selecting using eugenics to try and, if they have blue eyes, trying to date someone else or have offspring with someone that has blue eyes, this is very bad for them, for their offspring. It's not going to make the offspring fit to survive, because they're increasing their chances of having kids that have birth defects. And I'm not saying that, oh, if you have blue eyes and blonde hair, you can't have kids with someone else with blue eyes and blonde hair. But I am saying that after generations and generations of this happening, there are other recessive genes that do get passed down over time, which will lead to a less fit population in terms of just genetic conditions that can actually cause serious birth defects, more infant mortality rates, more babies that are born with birth defects. This is caused by the type of propaganda that they're spreading. So in reality, that this is actually going to cause a worse outcome for people. So I wouldn't recommend this at all. Please keep this in mind, that this stuff is not based in science, because if you actually look into science, you can see that it says the opposite of what they're trying to say, okay?